Captain Marcus Thorne's first thought upon regaining consciousness was that dying felt remarkably comfortable. The second thought was that military-issued burial shrouds had apparently improved dramatically since his last briefing on posthumous procedures. The third thought, the one that forced his eyes open despite the soft, warm lighting that seemed to caress rather than assault his vision, was that regulation burial chambers definitely didn't smell like jasmine and old books. He lay on what could only be described as the kind of bedding that existed in fever dreams of luxury, silk sheets that seemed to flow like water around his body, pillows that felt as if they'd been stuffed with distilled comfort, and blankets that maintained the perfect temperature despite the cool air moving through what appeared to be a tent of impossible sophistication. "Well," said a voice like honey mixed with starlight, "you're finally awake. I was beginning to wonder if you planned to sleep through the entire war." Marcus turned his head, slowly, because sudden movement still felt like a questionable life choice, and found himself looking at a woman who made his brain temporarily forget how to process visual information in any coherent manner. She sat in an ornate chair beside his bed, her posture suggesting both casual elegance and readiness for violence, though Marcus couldn't quite identify which possibility his nervous system found more alarming. Her skin held the kind of pale luminescence that suggested she'd never seen natural sunlight, but rather than appearing sickly, she seemed to glow with an inner light that made the tense ambient illumination seem crude by comparison. Dark hair cascaded over her shoulders in waves that caught and reflected light in ways that defied several principles of physics Marcus was reasonably certain he remembered correctly. But it was her eyes that made his heart skip in a rhythm that had nothing to do with his recent medical crisis, deep violet that seemed to contain depths he could fall into and never find his way back from. "I'm either dead," Marcus said, his voice emerging as a croak that suggested his throat had been conscripted for gravel production, "or I've been captured by someone with remarkably good taste in interior decorating." The woman's laugh was like music played on instruments that hadn't been invented yet, and Marcus felt something in his chest respond to the sound with recognition that made no sense whatsoever. "Neither, though both were distinct possibilities when my people found you collapsed near our territory's border." She gestured to a small table laden with what appeared to be medical supplies that looked both ancient and impossibly advanced. "You were suffering from severe dehydration, exposure to atmospheric toxins, and what our healers described as aggressive stupidity regarding basic survival protocols." Marcus tried to sit up, discovered that his body had apparently filed a formal complaint against movement in general, and settled for turning slightly to better see his mysterious host. "Your people. The Nix Collective," she said, as if this should mean something to him. "Though I suspect your military briefings used less diplomatic terminology." The pieces clicked together with the subtle impact of a tactical nuclear device detonating in Marcus's consciousness. The pale skin, the luminescent quality, the violet eyes, the casual reference to her people on a planet where only one non-human species was known to exist. "You're vampire," he said, the words emerging with the kind of calm that suggested his mind had decided to handle this revelation by temporarily disconnecting from all emotional processing centers. "Among other things," she agreed, her lips curving in a smile that revealed teeth which were exactly as perfect as everything else about her, including the slightly elongated canines that confirmed his identification. "I am Lydia Nocturne, Queen of the Nix territories and, apparently, your temporary medical provider." Marcus stared at her, his military training warring with the evidence of his senses. Everything he'd been taught about vampires suggested they were savage predators, barely sentient creatures that attacked humans on sight with mindless bloodlust. The elegant woman sitting beside his bed, discussing his medical treatment with the calm professionalism of someone who'd clearly spent considerable time and effort keeping him alive, didn't exactly match the profile. "I'm Captain Marcus Thorne, Terran Defense Corps," he said, defaulting to military protocol because it seemed like the only stable ground available in this conversation. "And I'm reasonably certain that accepting medical treatment from enemy combatants violates several regulations regarding, well, everything." "Enemy combatants," Lydia repeated, her tone suggesting she found the phrase amusing. "How wonderfully dramatic. Though I have to ask, Captain Thorne, do I seem particularly combative to you at the moment?" Marcus considered this question while studying her posture, her expression, and the complete absence of restraints keeping him in the bed. "Not immediately, no. Though my tactical training suggests that could change quickly. Your tactical training sounds rather paranoid. Your species has been trying to kill mine for the last 3 years. Paranoia seems appropriate. Lydia's expression shifted, becoming something that looked like genuine sadness mixed with frustration. Captain, in the 3 years since your species arrived on Nix 7, how many vampire attacks on human settlements have been directly verified by independent observers? Marcus frowned, trying to recall the specific intelligence reports. Dozens. The Meridian Colony massacre, the mining station raids, The Meridian Colony was destroyed by atmospheric storms, Lydia interrupted gently. The mining stations were abandoned due to equipment failures that released toxic gases. And every other vampire attack your intelligence services have reported occurred in areas where no vampires have lived for over a century. The certainty in her voice made Marcus's tactical instincts prickle with unease. That's not possible. We have evidence, recorded testimonies. You have what someone wanted you to have, Lydia said, rising from her chair with fluid grace that made Marcus think of dancers and predators in equal measure. The question is whether you're interested in discovering what you actually have, or whether you prefer the comfort of believing what you've been told. She moved to the tent's entrance, pulling aside a curtain that revealed a view that made Marcus's breath catch. Instead of the barren wasteland described in his mission briefings, he could see a valley filled with structures that seemed to grow organically from the landscape itself, architecture that blended art, function, and beauty in ways that suggested a civilization far older and more sophisticated than anything in the human colonies. You talked about me in your sleep, Lydia said softly, not turning around. For hours, while the fever had you. You described my appearance, my voice, even details about this tent that you couldn't possibly have known. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. That's impossible. Many things are impossible, Captain Thorne. Vampires and humans coexisting peacefully. Interstellar travel. The idea that two beings from different species could share dreams across space and time. She turned back to him, her violet eyes reflecting something that might have been hope. The question is whether you're brave enough to discover which impossibilities might actually be true. Marcus stared at her, his world tilting on an axis he hadn't known existed. Everything about this situation violated his training, his understanding of the conflict, and his basic assumptions about reality. But something deep in his chest, something that had recognized her laugh and felt at home in her presence, whispered that maybe his training had been incomplete. Why did you save me? He asked finally. Lydia's smile was like watching sunrise, if sunrise came with fangs and the promise that everything you thought you knew was about to change. Because, Captain Marcus Thorne, I've been dreaming about you for months. The concept of shared dreams, Marcus discovered, was considerably easier to accept when you were lying in silk sheets surrounded by impossible luxury than it would have been during a tactical briefing back at base. Still, accepting and understanding were two entirely different operations, and his brain was struggling to process the implications of Lydia's revelation. Dreams, he repeated, testing the word as if it might explode if pronounced incorrectly. You've been dreaming about me. Vivid, detailed dreams that included your name, your rank, even that particular way you have of checking your sidearm when you're nervous. Lydia settled back into her chair, her movements carrying the kind of unconscious grace that suggested centuries of practice. Also, you have a scar on your left shoulder from a training accident involving a malfunctioning gravity harness. Marcus's hand moved automatically to the spot she'd described, where a jagged white line marked the place where artificial gravity had decided to demonstrate the concept of catastrophic equipment failure during his academy days. How could you possibly know that? The same way you know that I have a tendency to pace when I'm thinking, that I collect ancient texts written in dead languages, and that I've been alone in this tent for exactly 47 days because my advisors think I need to focus on the war effort instead of pursuing what they consider philosophical distractions. The accuracy of her statement hit Marcus like cold space. He did know those things about her, had known them the moment he'd seen her, as if he'd been carrying around a detailed profile of Lydia Nocturne without realizing it. This is scientifically impossible, he said, falling back on his training in physics and military doctrine. Psychic phenomena aren't recognized by any legitimate research institution in the Terran Federation. The Terran Federation, Lydia said with the tone of someone discussing a particularly amusing children's story, also doesn't recognize that faster-than-light travel creates quantum entanglement between consciousness patterns, or that certain planetary conditions can amplify psychic resonance across interstellar distances. You're suggesting that traveling to Nix 7 somehow connected our minds? I'm suggesting that some connections exist outside the boundaries of what your Federation chooses to acknowledge. Lydia rose and moved to a section of the tent where books and scrolls were arranged with the kind of care usually reserved for religious artifacts. My people have been studying consciousness for millennia, Captain. We've learned that awareness isn't limited to the boundaries of individual brains. Marcus watched her select a volume bound in what appeared to be leather that shimmered with its own internal light. And you just happen to be studying the consciousness of random human soldiers? Not random. And not just soldiers. Lydia returned with the book, opening it to reveal pages covered in symbols that seemed to shift and flow as Marcus tried to focus on them. These are records of every documented case of cross-species psychic bonding in our history. It's rare, but not unprecedented. Cross-species psychic bonding, Marcus repeated, wondering if there was a regulation covering this situation or if he was venturing into entirely uncharted territory. That sounds like something that would definitely be mentioned in the mission briefings. Only if your mission briefings were designed to provide accurate information rather than maintain convenient prejudices. Lydia's tone carried an edge that suggested considerable frustration with the current state of interspecies relations. Tell me, Captain, what exactly were you told about vampire feeding requirements? Marcus shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that he was having this conversation while lying in bed wearing clothes he didn't remember putting on, in the tent of a creature he'd been trained to consider a mortal enemy. That vampires require human blood for survival and that exposure to sunlight is lethal. Half wrong and completely wrong, Lydia said with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation before. Vampires require life energy for survival, which can be derived from many sources. Human blood is actually a rather inefficient option, it's like trying to power a starship with candles. And the sunlight? Uncomfortable and potentially damaging with prolonged exposure, but hardly lethal. Rather like humans spending too much time in deep space without proper radiation shielding. Marcus stared at her, pieces of his worldview cracking and reforming like broken glass in zero gravity. Then why are our species at war? Lydia's laugh held no humor this time. An excellent question. Perhaps you could explain why human forces have been systematically destroying vampire settlements that posed no threat to anyone? Because you've been attacking our colonies. Have we? Lydia moved to another section of the tent, returning with what appeared to be a holographic display unit that was definitely not of human manufacture. Let me show you something interesting. The device activated with a soft chime, projecting a three-dimensional map of Nix 7 that showed both human and vampire territories. Marcus could see the human colonies clustered around the planet's equatorial region, while vampire settlements appeared to be concentrated in the polar areas where eternal twilight provided optimal living conditions. Notice anything? Lydia asked, manipulating the display to show movement patterns over the past 3 years. Marcus studied the projection, his tactical training automatically analyzing the territorial distributions. Your settlements are nowhere near our colonies. There's at least 1,000 kilometers of empty space between the closest human and vampire populations. Exactly. So how, precisely, would vampire attacks on human settlements be logistically possible without some form of transportation that would show up on your orbital surveillance systems? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Marcus felt something cold settling in his stomach that had nothing to do with his recent medical crisis. You're suggesting that the attacks were staged. I'm suggesting that someone has been working very hard to ensure that humans and vampires remain enemies instead of potential allies. Lydia deactivated the display, her expression becoming something that looked like carefully controlled anger. The question is why? Before Marcus could formulate a response, a sound echoed across the valley that made his blood freeze, the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery shells. His military training kicked in immediately, and he was moving toward the tense entrance before his conscious mind had finished processing the threat. "Incoming fire," he said automatically, his body defaulting to combat protocols. "We need to reach shelter immediately." Lydia's hand on his arm stopped him mid-stride, her grip strong enough to remind him that vampire strength was considerably beyond human norms. "Marcus, those shells are targeting vampire settlements. Your forces are conducting what appears to be a systematic bombardment of civilian areas." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. "That's impossible. We don't target civilians. It's against every regulation in the military code." "Then perhaps," Lydia said softly, her violet eyes reflecting the light of explosions in the distance, "you should consider who's giving the orders, and whether the people following them know what they're actually being asked to do." Marcus stood frozen in the tense entrance, watching artillery fire rain down on a civilization he'd been told didn't exist, launched by forces he'd been trained to serve, targeting people who'd shown him nothing but kindness. "This is wrong," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of everything he believed about duty, honor, and the cause he'd been fighting for. "Yes," Lydia agreed, her hand still on his arm, warm and solid and real. "The question is what you plan to do about it." Marcus looked at her, then at the valley where ancient buildings were burning under human weapons, then back at her face, beautiful, alien, and completely honest in ways that made his chest ache with recognition. "I need to contact my unit," he said finally. "They need to know the truth about what's happening here. And if they don't believe you?" Marcus considered this possibility, then looked again at the woman whose dreams had somehow become tangled with his own across impossible distances. "Then I guess I'll have to decide whether I'm a soldier first, or a human being." Lydia's smile was sad and proud simultaneously. "That, Captain Marcus Thorne, is the most hopeful thing anyone has said on this planet in 3 years." Marcus's attempt to contact his unit began with optimism and ended with the kind of existential crisis that usually required professional counseling. His communication device, which had somehow survived his collapse in the field, connected perfectly to the military network. The conversation that followed, however, suggested that surviving the technology was considerably easier than surviving the politics. "Captain Thorne." The voice of Colonel Hendricks crackled through the calm with a particular quality that suggested he was speaking to someone he'd written off as dead. "Son, where the hell are you? We've had search teams combing that sector for 2 days. "Safe, sir, though I've encountered some complications regarding our intelligence about vampire populations in this area." Marcus paused, trying to find words that would convey the magnitude of what he'd discovered without sounding like he'd suffered brain damage during his collapse. "Colonel, I need to report significant discrepancies between our briefing materials and the actual situation on the ground." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Marcus to wonder if the communication had been severed. When Hendricks finally responded, his tone had shifted from relief to something that sounded like carefully controlled alarm. "Captain, I need you to listen carefully. You've been missing for 48 hours in hostile territory, and there's a strong possibility that your communications are being monitored by enemy forces. Whatever you think you've discovered, we'll debrief properly once you're back at base. Sir, with respect, the vampire population in this area is not hostile. In fact, they've provided medical assistance and—" "Captain Thorne." The colonel's voice carried the kind of authority that could stop plasma fire through sheer force of disapproval. "You are suffering from exposure-related disorientation and possibly enemy psychological manipulation. Your current location is compromised, and any information you provide over open channels could endanger ongoing operations." Marcus felt something cold settling in his chest as he realized that his commanding officer wasn't just dismissing his report, he was actively refusing to consider that it might contain accurate information. "Sir, I'm reporting evidence of systematic intelligence failures that have led to—" "Captain, you are hereby ordered to maintain radio silence and return to base immediately. Any further communication regarding your current situation will be considered a breach of operational security." The connection terminated with the kind of finality that suggested the conversation was over whether Marcus wanted it to be or not. He stared at the communication device, feeling as if he'd just watched his faith in military hierarchy dissolve into quantum foam. That, he said to Lydia, who had been listening with the polite attention of someone eavesdropping on a conversation that was confirming her worst suspicions, did not go according to plan. "I'm shocked," Lydia replied with the dry tone of someone whose shock was purely theoretical. A military organization refusing to acknowledge evidence that contradicts their established narrative? Unprecedented. Marcus activated his device's tracking function, hoping to find his unit's current position, and discovered something that made his stomach drop toward his boots. According to the military network, Captain Marcus Thorne had been officially listed as missing in action, presumed dead, approximately 6 hours ago. "Well," he said, studying the casualty report that included his own name, "this is either a clerical error or someone really wants me to stay dead." Lydia moved to look over his shoulder, her presence close enough that he could smell something like starlight and old books. "Or someone wants to ensure that whatever you discovered during your reconnaissance mission never makes it back to your command structure." The implication hit Marcus like a tactical nuke. "You're suggesting that my mission was designed to fail?" "I'm suggesting that you might want to consider why a routine reconnaissance operation sent a single soldier into territory that your military believes is crawling with hostile vampires." Lydia's voice carried the kind of patience usually reserved for explaining basic physics to particularly slow students. "Either your commanders have a remarkably casual attitude toward your survival, or they needed you to be in a position where your testimony could be easily dismissed." Marcus accessed his mission files, reviewing the orders that had seemed routine 48 hours ago and now appeared to glow with suspicious coincidence. His assignment had been to conduct surveillance on vampire population centers, gathering intelligence on defensive capabilities and territorial boundaries. Standard reconnaissance work, except for the part where he'd been sent alone into an area that supposedly contained thousands of hostile aliens. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, scrolling through tactical assessments that described vampire settlements as heavily fortified military installations rather than the artistic communities he'd observed from Lydia's tent. These intelligence reports describe a completely different civilization than what actually exists here. "That's because they're not intelligence reports," Lydia said, settling into a chair beside him with the grace of someone who'd had centuries to perfect the art of sitting down. "They're propaganda designed to justify military action against a population that poses no threat to human colonies." "But why would?" Marcus stopped mid-sentence as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "The mining rights. Someone wants exclusive access to Nick 7's resources." Lydia nodded approvingly. "Now you're beginning to understand. This planet contains crystalline formations that could revolutionize interstellar travel and energy production. The kind of discovery that would be worth trillions of credits to whoever controls the extraction rights." Marcus accessed the economic databases through his military connection, cross-referencing corporate interests with the timing of the conflict. What he found made his blood run cold with a chill that had nothing to do with Nick 7's atmospheric conditions. "Meridian Industrial Consortium," he said, reading the data that painted a picture of coordinated corporate manipulation. They'd been lobbying for exclusive mining contracts on Nick 7 since before the first human colonies were established. But they couldn't get approval while the planet had an established sentient population with territorial rights. Unless that population could be classified as a hostile threat to human expansion, Lydia continued, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd watched this scenario play out across multiple worlds. "A species that attacks human settlements without provocation, that poses an existential danger to peaceful colonization efforts. A species that needs to be eliminated for the safety of human civilians," Marcus finished, feeling sick as he understood the full scope of what had been done. "How many people know the truth? Among your species? Very few. The corporate interests behind this operation have been careful to ensure that even the military personnel carrying out their agenda believe they're fighting a just war against savage predators." Marcus stared at his communication device, at the casualty report listing him as presumed dead, at the mission files that had sent him into what was supposed to be certain death. "They wanted me to die out there. A soldier killed by vampire attacks while conducting reconnaissance would provide perfect justification for escalating the military response. Except you survived, and now you know the truth. Lydia's hand found his, her touch warm and solid and real in ways that made his chest ache with recognition. The question is what you plan to do with that knowledge. Before Marcus could formulate an answer, an alarm began wailing across the vampire settlement, not the mechanical warning systems he was familiar with from human colonies, but something organic and musical that seemed to resonate directly with his nervous system. "What is that?" he asked, already knowing from Lydia's expression that the answer wouldn't be good. "Final assault warning," she said, rising with the fluid speed of someone whose survival reflexes had been honed over centuries. "Your forces are preparing for a concentrated attack on our population centers." Marcus accessed his military network, pulling up operational orders that made his heart sink. Operation Daybreak. Complete elimination of vampire presence on Nix-7, scheduled to commence in exactly 18 hours. 18 hours, Lydia repeated, her voice carrying the weight of someone calculating the survival odds of everyone she'd ever cared about. "How many civilians do your estimates suggest will be killed?" Marcus studied the tactical projections, feeling each number like a physical blow. "All of them. This isn't a military operation, it's genocide designed to look like a defensive action." Lydia was quiet for a long moment, her violet eyes reflecting something that looked like the end of hope. Then, slowly, her expression shifted into something that reminded Marcus that vampires had survived for millennia because they were considerably more dangerous than their elegant appearance suggested. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air around them seem to hum with potential energy, "how would you feel about preventing a war?" "I'd feel great about it," he replied immediately. "Though I should probably mention that I'm officially dead, my commanding officers think I'm suffering from psychological manipulation, and I have approximately zero credibility with anyone in a position to stop this operation." "Then we'll have to find another way," Lydia said, moving toward a section of the tent where Marcus could see communication equipment that looked both ancient and impossibly advanced. "Fortunately, my people have been documenting every aspect of this conflict, including evidence of the corporate manipulation behind it. Evidence that could expose the truth about what's really happening here. Evidence that could broadcast the truth to every human and vampire on this planet simultaneously." Lydia's smile was sharp enough to cut through military-grade deception. "Sometimes, Captain Thorne, the best way to prevent a war is to make sure everyone knows who actually started it." Marcus looked at her, at the communication equipment that could potentially save thousands of lives, at his own hands that were supposed to be dead according to official records. "Well," he said, feeling lighter than he had since awakening in silk sheets, "I always wanted to try overthrowing a corporate conspiracy." How hard could it be? Overthrowing a corporate conspiracy, Marcus discovered, was significantly more complicated than his optimistic assessment had suggested, but considerably more satisfying than following orders that made no moral sense. The vampire communication system, which Lydia called the Archive, operated on principles that made human technology look like children's toys built from spare parts and wishful thinking. "It's a consciousness-linked network," Lydia explained as she manipulated interfaces that responded to thought as much as touch. "Every vampire who's ever lived has contributed memories, experiences, and knowledge to the collective record. Including, as it happens, detailed documentation of every human military action on Nix-7 for the past 3 years." Marcus watched data streams that looked like liquid light flowing through crystalline conduits, carrying information in formats his brain wasn't equipped to process directly. "So you have evidence of everything that's happened here?" "Everything. Including corporate communications between Meridian Industrial Consortium executives and certain members of your military leadership, financial transfers that correlate precisely with escalations in anti-vampire propaganda, and detailed plans for post-genocide mining operations that were finalized before the first vampire attack was reported." "That's enough evidence to bring down the entire operation," Marcus said, feeling hope and horror warring in his chest. "But how do we get it to people who matter?" Lydia's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who'd been planning this conversation for months. "We broadcast it everywhere simultaneously. Human communication networks, vampire collective consciousness, even the emergency channels used by corporate oversight committees back on Earth. That would require access to military encryption codes that I definitely don't have, Marcus pointed out, trying to inject some realism into their revolutionary enthusiasm. Actually, Lydia said, her fingers dancing across controls that seemed to be made of crystallized music, it requires something much more valuable than encryption codes. It requires a human military officer with verified genetic markers and biometric authentication who can authorize emergency broadcasts under the Interstellar Truth in Wartime Act. Marcus stared at her. I'm officially dead. My biometric authentication was revoked when they listed me as casualties. But you're not actually dead, which means your genetic markers still match the authorization codes in the system. Lydia's violet eyes sparkled with something that might have been mischief if mischief could potentially prevent genocide. Turns out that military bureaucracy has some interesting loopholes when it comes to posthumous testimony. The next several hours involved Marcus learning more about vampire technology, corporate espionage, and his own genetic code than he'd expected to discover in a lifetime of military service. The archive didn't just store information, it wove together consciousness, memory, and knowledge in ways that allowed him to experience the evidence rather than simply reviewing it. Through the vampire collective memory, he witnessed corporate executives planning the destruction of an entire civilization with the casual efficiency of people scheduling a business meeting. He saw military commanders receiving orders that were designed to escalate conflict while keeping the soldiers in the field ignorant of the true agenda. Most disturbing, he experienced the memories of vampires who tried to establish peaceful contact with human colonies, only to be met with weapons fire based on intelligence reports that portrayed their diplomatic overtures as hostile reconnaissance. This is insane, Marcus said, his consciousness slowly separating from the archive's data streams. They've manipulated every aspect of this conflict to ensure maximum bloodshed and minimum questions. Welcome to corporate warfare, Lydia replied, her hands still working to compile the evidence into formats that human communication systems could process. Though I have to admit, the scope of this operation is impressive even by the standards of interstellar capitalism. How long have you known about all this? My people suspected corporate manipulation from the beginning, but we couldn't prove it without access to human communication networks. Lydia paused in her work, turning to look at him with an expression that contained depths he was only beginning to understand. We needed someone on the inside who was both capable of accessing those networks and trustworthy enough to act on the evidence regardless of personal cost. And you found that someone in your dreams? I found you in dreams that showed me possible futures where this conflict ends without destroying both our species. Lydia's voice carried something that sounded like reverence mixed with wonder. Though I have to admit, I didn't expect you to be quite so willing to commit treason against your own military hierarchy. Marcus considered this assessment. Is it treason if you're preventing genocide based on corporate lies? Technically, yes. Practically, it's the most moral thing anyone has done on this planet in 3 years. The communication system chimed with a sound like distant bells, indicating that their evidence compilation was complete and ready for broadcast. Marcus looked at the activation controls, knowing that pressing them would end his military career and probably land him in a Federation prison for the rest of his natural life. Second thoughts? Lydia asked, her hand finding his with the kind of certainty that had nothing to do with temporal sight and everything to do with understanding who he was at his core. Third and fourth thoughts, Marcus admitted. But they all lead to the same conclusion. He placed his palm on the biometric scanner, feeling his genetic markers authenticate against military databases that still thought he was dead. Some things are more important than following orders. The broadcast initiated with a harmonic resonance that seemed to vibrate through every communication device on the planet simultaneously. Marcus could feel the vampire collective consciousness linking with human networks, creating a bridge of shared information that bypassed every security protocol and encryption system ever devised. Across Nix 7, human soldiers received evidence that their vampire enemies were actually victims of corporate manipulation. Corporate executives found their private communications displayed on public screens. Military commanders discovered that their orders had come not from Federation Command but from Meridian Industrial Consortium subsidiaries. "It's working," Lydia said, her consciousness still partially linked to the archive as reports flooded in from across the planet. "Human forces are standing down. Corporate security teams are being arrested by their own personnel. The operation has been completely exposed." Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since awakening in Lydia's tent, the sensation that he was finally doing something that aligned with every moral principle he'd joined the military to uphold. "What happens now?" "Now we find out whether love is stronger than politics," Lydia replied, her violet eyes reflecting something that looked like the birth of new possibilities. The response came faster than either of them had expected. Within hours, representatives from both human and vampire populations were requesting joint meetings to establish new cooperative frameworks. The Federation Council initiated emergency hearings into corporate manipulation of military operations. Most importantly, the scheduled genocide operation was permanently cancelled as both species worked to understand how they'd been manipulated into hating each other. But for Marcus, the most significant change was personal rather than political. The shared consciousness link with Lydia that had begun as a tactical necessity had evolved into something that made the concept of separation feel like amputating part of his soul. "I can't go back," he said as they watched the sunrise from her tent, the first time he'd seen Nick 7-star without expecting to die before nightfall. "Even if they offered me full pardons and reinstatement, I can't pretend that my old life makes sense anymore." "The Vampire Collective has voted to offer you permanent citizenship," Lydia said, her hand warm in his as they watched human and vampire representatives meeting in the valley below. "Though I should warn you that vampire citizenship comes with certain modifications to your basic physiology. Such as extended lifespan, enhanced regenerative capabilities, and the ability to share consciousness with your bonded partner." Lydia's smile was soft and uncertain in ways that reminded Marcus that even vampire queens could be vulnerable. "Also, a permanent psychic link with someone who talks too much about ancient literature and has strong opinions about proper tea preparation." Marcus laughed, feeling lighter than he had since childhood. "The lifespan extension sounds good, and I could use some enhanced healing after my recent medical adventures. As for the consciousness link..." He turned to face her fully, this woman who had saved his life, opened his mind, and helped him become someone he could actually respect. "I think I'd like to find out what forever feels like with you. Even though it means giving up everything you thought you wanted from life. Especially because it means giving up everything I thought I wanted for something I didn't know was possible." Marcus stood, pulling her up with him, marveling at how right it felt to have her hand in his. "Besides, I've always been curious about vampire literature, and I suspect you could teach me things about tea that would revolutionize my entire understanding of beverage preparation." Lydia's laugh was like sunrise and starlight combined, and Marcus realized that this was what happiness felt like, not the satisfaction of completing a mission or following orders, but the deep contentment of finding someone whose dreams had become tangled with his own across impossible distances. "In that case, Captain Marcus Thorne," she said, her voice carrying promises of adventures that would span centuries and possibilities that stretched across multiple dimensions, "welcome to the rest of your life." They stood together watching the first day of peace between their species, knowing that they had helped create something beautiful from the ashes of manufactured hatred. Around them, the vampire settlement buzzed with the kind of hope that comes from discovering that enemies can become allies, that lies can be exposed by truth, and that sometimes the most impossible love stories are the ones that change the galaxy. Marcus squeezed Lydia's hand, feeling the certainty of their shared future flowing through their consciousness link like music he'd been waiting his entire life to hear. They had prevented a genocide, exposed a corporate conspiracy, and found each other despite every attempt to keep them apart. "So," he said, grinning at the woman whose dreams had saved both their species, "what do vampire queens do for fun when they're not preventing interstellar wars?" "Oh," Lydia replied, her violet eyes sparkling with mischief and promise, "I have a few ideas. Though I should warn you, vampire entertainment tends to involve a lot more temporal manipulation and interdimensional travel than human recreation." "Perfect," Marcus said, pulling her closer as the sunrise painted their new world in shades of possibility. I was getting bored with single-dimensional existence anyway. And in the growing light of Nick Seven's dawn, surrounded by the evidence that love could indeed conquer corporate conspiracies and manufactured hatred, they began planning a future that would make their shared dreams look like modest proposals.